Hi, Casey. Thank you so much for agreeing to have this conversation with me
You're
and
welcome.
to let me record it as well. So what I would love to do before we go any further is just give you a chance to talk to us a little bit about yourself and all of the different hats that you wear so that we get to know a little bit about you, and then we'll kick off.
Okay, that sounds good. Um, oh, right. Okay, so how far back do we go? Uh, I'll start with the professional bit, shall we? Yeah, so professionally, I'm an architect. So I haven't practiced architecture for a good number of years now in terms of being involved in project delivery and design. But that is my background, and that's how I've ended up where I am now, I think. Um, but now I run Digital Green. I offer digital transformation services. So it's not a software hardware side of things. It's a people first approach to what digital and data can do for organisations that own and operate assets. That's my focus. And how did I get there? After my first job as an architect, I stayed at that company for almost 15 years, which I think is unheard of these days in most people's careers. Um, but I stayed there for 15 years and began to feel that once I'd qualified as an architect, I always wanted to learn. So within the early parts of that career, I finished my architecture professional qualification, then kind of went, what now? So then I became a BREEAM assessor for understanding how to sustainably develop or create sustainable developments. And I could then judge and monitor various different aspects of developments. Um, and then kind of digital kicked off at that point. So I brought sustainability, hence the green part of Digital Green, to my architectural practice, and then understood how to deliver those things using digital tools. And it was kind of at that point that my interest in the digital things and data side of things became more prevalent over the sustainability things. Um, and at that point, I think there was a lot of movement in the market in terms of the government putting in place what is called a BIM mandate back in 2011, which kicked in 2016. So industry companies were looking at appointing people who had that experience, and I ended up at Arup um, for 4 years as an associate director there, in charge of digitalizing their architectural side. And then towards the end of that, I decided that actually there was a lot of work that I was doing that was relevant to more owner operators, and I could run my own company doing it. So it's at that point that I set up Digital Green. Then I ended up working with another global engineering company, a Dutch company, um, and that's really when my work with the UK BIM Alliance and buildingSMART really started to grow. And we can talk a bit more about that later. But yeah, here I am now, 6 years after starting the company, uh, doing what I enjoy. I'm bringing digital and sustainability to owner operators in the real estate world, and doing what I can to promote the good sides of that to people for on a pro bono aspect to see if we can get the rest of industry understanding what those benefits are.
Wow, that's quite a journey, right? And
Yeah,
I had no idea you were an architect by trade, which
there you
is
go.
amazing. So I feel like I'm gonna learn a lot in this conversation. So sustainability. I was fully coming here prepared to talk to you about BIM, but I think it would be remiss not to touch on sustainability, considering what a hot topic this is within the real
Mm,
estate industry at the moment. I guess the first thing I would say to you is how have you found the it's a big challenge, but how have you found the process of starting to look at the combination of digital and digital solutions to this
mm.
problem that, frankly, my sense is that we still don't know how to solve it?
Uh, yes, there's no two ways about it. We are failing, and that's the reason the world is in the position it's in. Um, but from my perspective, bringing the two together, digital and the sustainability side, that you can't feasibly solve or understand what your impact is on the planet without digital. Do it in an analog way is just, it makes no sense whatsoever. So this is where real estate organizations have to first of all understand what they have, understand the performance of it as a whole, and then how to break that down into the embodied carbon elements and the in-use carbon elements, plus then where all the materials come from and all of those things. So it depends how deep you want to go. But let's face it, when it comes to the ESG requirements, most people want to be able to demonstrate that they meet and adhere those specific reporting requirements rather than actually getting the benefit from them. And I think there is a mindset shift that is not just within the real estate industry, it's hitting the general public. We've got energy prices, material hikes in cost of food production and all of those things, and it all contributes to the sustainability argument or discussion, at least. So people are more aware of what things need to be done, whether it's a really hot summer in the UK or whether it's droughts and weather events that we don't normally have. These things are all real. They're happening right now, and I think that level of general understanding out there in the public is being raised. So hence, industry's having to keep up with that. And one of the things that we'll come back to this, but one of the things that we've enabled through the discussion with the UK BIM Alliance rebranding to Nima and focusing on information management is that we've enabled a working relationship with an organisation called Zero Construct. And it's a global organisation, again, free pro bono volunteers who just come together to say, right, how do we decarbonise the construction process? And one of their work streams is looking at our general understanding of what carbon looks like, what it feels like, how much embodied carbon is there in a thing. So we can pick up a food packet and it tells us how many grams of whatever is in a product. But we don't have anything similar to that in our industry for the built environment. Plus also, wouldn't it be good if, and I know some food manufacturers are doing it, if you can make that real and tangible to someone, to the general public, it will take you 35 minutes of walking to burn off the calories that are in this thing. And if we had that aspect of it to carbon, because there's no point in saying there's X amount of tons of carbon in this concrete frame, because that doesn't really mean anything. So how can we make it mean something to the individual? So there's lots of those different things. So yes, digital is an enabler of understanding not only what you have, but the performance of it during its life cycle, plus also embodied carbon in understanding quantities and all sorts of those things. So realistically, there's many different aspects of the ESG requirements, of decarbonisation, of the bigger sustainability topic. So yeah, how else do we do that?
I love the way that you've articulated that, because I'm a huge fan of breaking things down into really kind of consumable, in a consumable way, let's say. And I completely agree with you. I think unless you've studied either architecture or some form of science, it's very difficult for a layman like myself to kind of understand that true impact, and wouldn't it be transformational? But do you think that there is, so I'm seeing a lot of prop tech at the moment that is coming up with an ESG agenda. One of the things that I'm struggling to quantify, though, is whether this is branding or whether there is a real kind of growth in this area that you're seeing of really, valuable solutions that are going to, move the needle ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, back when, as I said, when I studied to become a BREEAM assessor, the phrase greenwash was all over the place, and lots of people paying lip service to understanding how their buildings perform, whether they get a BREEAM rating or a LEED rating or a WELL rating now, whichever one they get. It's a certificate of marketing purposes more than anything. And that's what I hope we'd avoid with the ESG reporting. Hopefully people are taking it a little bit more seriously now, because as I said, the understanding of decarbonisation, the requirement for it, and to better look after our planet is much greater now than it was back then. So the awareness has been raised, but I would hope that all of those organisations who are looking at their ESG reporting, but not just reporting, actually making it mean something. And that, because if they're just doing it to report, there's no point whatsoever. If they're doing it to change the way they operate, brilliant. Let's learn from it. Let's get the insights. Let's change the way companies and developments are run and how they're performing, and how the individual organisations themselves are doing that. Because otherwise, it's pointless. and we're just running around chasing our tails, doing these things just for the sake of doing it. We're being sold various different solutions by various different providers as the fix or the enabling of reporting. But actually, what does it mean? It's what you do with those reports that matters.
Oh, absolutely. You're talking to an analyst that built many reports and then, wondered where they landed or
It's
what
even
happened.
gathering dust.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So I'm gonna change tact a little bit because I want to get back on the data road, if you like, and move away slightly from technology, even though there's a strong relationship there. You mentioned the UK BIM Alliance. Could you talk to me a little bit about what that is?
Yes, I can. Technically, it doesn't exist anymore. So the UK BIM Alliance has rebranded only 1 month ago. So we're now called Nima. It's not an abbreviation, acronym, or initialization or anything. It's a Greek word that means thread. So that is, it brings it back straight back to that data point, is that we're trying to get across that the importance of having a data thread for many different purposes. There'll be lots of different threads. It might even end up as being a tapestry at the end, but we've got lots of different threads of data, whether it's to do with carbon data or fire and life safety data or performance or operational data. We need to understand where it was from, who created, what the provenance of it is, how true it is, how often it changes, and all of those things, because the design and construction process is just a small part of it, but the operation and the entire life cycle is what the BIM process covers. So it's really about understanding the BIM process as being a way of creating or defining, delivering and creating and checking and assuring and using all of that data. So in that respect, Nima is a volunteer organisation. We're a non-profit, and we're there to share as much as we can about the best practice ways of doing these things.
Very good. And I'll remember that it is Nima now. So can you talk to me a little bit about BIM? And the reason I ask about this is because I'm a huge fan of clarifying kind of definitions of things. And I'll be frank, with a lot of misconceptions about what BIM is, and I sort of almost wrote it off as something that is related to construction and development works, rather than what I'm learning a little bit more about it. But can you tell me what BIM is, as someone who doesn't know anything about BIM?
Okay, so I'll tell you, it's probably easier to define what it isn't as well. So in one statement, I guess, BIM is not about 3D models, and that's the perception that has gained traction in the market because of the efforts of software providers that provide BIM authoring tools to create the models, to create the data. So it's not necessarily about that. So BIM is about building information modeling, or as a noun, it's building an information model. So it's a process. There is a series of international standards that were born from a series of British standards that came from the UK government mandate. So they said, right, this is what we want to do in 2016. And prior to that, the UK created a set of British standards and specifications that became the international standards, the ISO 19650 suite. So that process is understanding how to specify the information required, how to deliver that information that's required, and then how to use that. And it's a life cycle thing. And I think it's important to understand it's not just design and construction, it's a life cycle thing. So that data can be used, updated throughout the life cycle of whatever asset it is, not just buildings, it works for infrastructure as well. So ultimately, what we'll end up with in an ideal world is a structured set of data about that particular asset. And that's really where we like to think of the BIM process as ending, in terms of the static data about those assets, all the properties relating to maintainable assets and all of those things. And then we start to talk about the future and about digital twins and about the dynamic data. So you're adding different data sets to the static data set of just what you've got. So we can get all the way up to that point of having a really nice, clean, checked, assured set of data about the thing that you're trying to own and operate, which can then be embellished with other sets of data.
So I'm glad you said that, because my next question was going to be define asset, because that's one thing that one word I think that's used in many different, let's say, with many different connotations, or referring to many different things. So in this case, are we talking about asset as a property or a piece of land, or?
Yeah, it's a physical thing, and we lean on the definition that's in ISO 55000, which sets out how to maintain and operate things for asset management. But yeah, we lean on that as the definition, and I can't remember the exact wording, but it's a physical thing that needs maintaining. But obviously there are processes that could be defined as being assets in themselves around those physical objects. So there are business processes that sit around them.
Are we saying, or are you saying, and I hate to put words in your mouth, that BIM could essentially, as a concept or as an information management process, can be applied to all different types of data, regardless, so outside of the construction industry?
I mean, at a stretch, yeah. I mean, I've taught this in various different situations, different groups of people, and a project manager once said, "But isn't this just best practice project management?" I went, "Well, yes, it is." So the understanding of what information you need and what purpose you're going to use it for is the first thing to understand, and that isn't as common as we'd like to think it should be, because of the nature of the built environment. A lot of people who build something are first time clients. They've never done it before. It's quite unusual to have a repeat client who's been there, done it, and just keeps doing the same thing over and over again, like you would have with product manufacture. But we have people who buy a site and say, I want to build a hotel, or I want to build a school, or I want to build a whatever, an office. And they're developers who aren't necessarily portfolio developers. They're single developers. So yes, understanding what data you need, appointing a team with the correct contracts so that they deliver the data, not just drawings to deliver that thing or documents to deliver that thing. Then checking the data when it's received, holding and storing that information in a format that enables it to be flexibly used and accessed securely. And then we start to get, as we said, mixing that static data set with other types of data to get insight, and then exploiting that data throughout. So yes, it's just a very good framework for understanding that whole process of requiring and procuring data.
You're not biased by any means, are you?
Well, I am, but it's an international standard for a reason, and it's one of those standards that is there to be leaned on, and it has been developed through consensus around the world, with organizations around the world, with governments around the world. So yeah, it's kind of the proof is there, that other people are using it, and we have nothing else in our industry right now that does that same thing. And if other industries want to lean on that, then go for it.
I mean, that's definitely one of the thoughts that I was, kind of was ringing in my mind. The fact that, I worked quite heavily with occupier data in particular, and there is no one standard that we lean on, which is incredibly challenging, especially when you're dealing with multiple technology providers, with multiple clients, with multiple, let's say, services or data domains, and you're trying to integrate them, but there hasn't been that, let's say, that holistic thought process that has, structured that information so that you're able to make sense of it. So that kind of leads me, I guess, to my next, question, which is, what impact do you think that has had on the construction industry? Because clearly that's kind of the biggest uptake of BIM has been in that space, unless you're going to tell me that there has been applications in different outside of construction.
Well, no, not that I've looked at to understand if I could answer that properly, no. But actually I'd like to go back, and this is something we can come back to later, but the question or the comment about not having one data format and working with lots of different multiple software providers and things like that. This is where my role as chair of buildingSMART UK and Ireland comes in. So buildingSMART International is a global organisation, who create and oversee the extension of an open data format for describing things in the built environment. So there's an open data schema. So I chair the UK and Ireland chapter, and my role is to gather the requirements and needs for extending that schema and use of that schema and implementing it from the UK and Ireland, and then feeding that up to the international level to inform that. So we have a schema, a language that we can use to digitally describe the built and natural environment. So it's there and it exists. So that's we can come back to that later. But in terms of how often BIM is used in ISO 19650 terms, in standardized terms, not as much as we'd like, put it that way. If we rewind a bit, the UK government, as I said, they stated that there will be a mandate that kicks in 2016. So that was in 2011. The standards were drafted and written up to a period of up to 2016, where there are a suite of standards ready to be used. And the mandate covered what the phrase I think is centrally procured government projects. And there weren't that many of them every year, but there are local government projects that weren't centrally funded, but some of the local governments developed various different projects that tried to use the standards as well, which was great and did it successfully. But what we'd like to see is what happened because of that government mandate. The private sectors picked it up also. So the private sectors went, there's a standardized way of doing this. The government's saying they're doing it for all these reasons, for eliminating waste and understanding better data communications throughout it, being able to cut carbon usage and all of those things. So there was a set of statistics that said these are the things we want to do, and the private sector were kind of like, oh, we need to do that also. So let's just jump on that. So in a lot of ways, the private sector has run with these things, and you'll see probably greater successes in the private sector than you will in the government sector. And that's what we're hoping to see, and keep up that level of momentum of the government now, again, in various other different guises and initiatives, saying this is what we want, this is what we want, and this is what we want. And that pushes not only the government clients, but the private sector as well. So there are lots of people learning in lots of different ways, working on all sorts of different projects. My advice is to pick up the standards or the processes and understand your position as a stakeholder within that. Ignore everything else. You don't need to do everything else. You just pull out the bits that are going to make your business and your daily life a lot easier, simpler, just more streamlined, and all of those things. Just pick out the bits that make a difference to you and get good at those. Be selfish about it. And this is, I get myself in trouble sometimes when people talk about BIM being about collaboration. No, park that. Be selfish first. Get the benefit first for you as an individual. Don't worry about the team playing. Just work to the standards, understand your bit first, and then when someone else has done the same, you end up working together really easily because you know what to expect and you know how to do it. So that's my unofficial advice, is to be selfish about it and find your own way through it. Then things become easier when you're working with other people.
I think it's very clever advice, right? All roads lead to Rome, if you like. I just wanted to touch on the point that you made earlier around regulation. Can you talk a little bit about what type of regulation you see kind of coming in where it relates to BIM?
Yes, so we can. So we try not to regulate about the implementation of BIM itself, but what we're seeing happening is people regulating about uses of data that comes out of BIM. So where we've got ESG requirements, that a BIM process can produce a lot of the data that is helpful in the ESG process of reporting later on down the line. It adds that transparency level to it. But more recently in the UK, we've had the fire and life safety through the Golden Thread work, and the Building Safety Act that's just been published in July, I think it was. So there are now requirements for data to be delivered that reflect the aspects of a high-risk buildings, residential buildings, that came out the back of Grenfell. So these are the things that are required now. So information about that particular type of building is required across the board. So you kind of think, and we can see this extending obviously to many other different building types. I spent most of my architectural career designing, being involved in designing sports stadia. around the world. So they should have exactly the same requirements. So yes, they have to be designed to a particular standard, but actually, what is it about the information and the data that you need that supports and describes those particular standards? And again, there's so many different uses for it that actually the use cases or purposes for the information that we're creating is the important part to be regulated and checked, not the process of doing it. So those things are being real now. So we're seeing more traction about those particular things, whether it's a regulation or a guide or whatever else. We're seeing a lot more of those practical daily challenges being solved and enabled by a BIM process.
It's interesting because I mean, I'm thinking of my days doing playing with occupier data, and some of that data is non-critical. Not all of it is highly sensitive or regulated in that kind of way. But from a private organization's perspective or a private company's perspective, ultimately your data is an asset, right? It can, it has an economic value even if you don't apply that value or you don't talk about it. And ultimately, it's either money that you're not getting through the front door or money that is escaping in a variety of different ways that you can, you don't need to be losing. And I think if we were able to adopt some of the rigor that that you're talking about with regards to BIM and construction, and I understand that rigor has to be there to save lives, but those are different, let's say, objectives, right? For an organization that is revenue driven, well, ultimately you need to make sure that you're surviving. You need to make sure that you're not wasting your money and being able to put back into things like sustainability, right? Sustainability plans. So that's super interesting. So I guess it might be a little bit redundant to ask you what you think BIM has done for the construction industry, because we know that a big chunk of the real estate industry is still analog in many, many different ways, and especially where it relates to data. But what do you think that BIM has actually done for the industry?
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank you for saying that data is an asset in itself. Because that's something we're promoting, and it's something a colleague of mine, Emma Hooper, says all the time in the presentations, and it's amazing how many people don't acknowledge that in our industry. And yet, I think again, a discussion that I saw online, someone said that data about a built asset and a 3D model of representation of it will be as ubiquitous as having a smartphone in your pocket, and you wonder how you ever managed without it. And that's kind of where we're leading to. Because people like you and I are like, well, why don't you have a virtual representation of your assets? Why don't you know exactly how they perform? And it's amazing how our industry still continues on quite obviously a lack of data and true information about whatever it happens to be. But in terms of where we are and how we've got to where we've got to, I think there are opportunities we're missing. And I think there's lots of real use cases that affect everybody, whether you're a product manufacturer, whether you're an owner of a thing, an asset, a rail line, or whether you're a user of a public service that relies on those things. The data really does support. It's a foundation of all of those different services. So when you get your phone out and you're checking a timetable, it's data that's there that we use and rely on for our everyday lives. So why shouldn't we have that in the private sector operation of a thing? And that's part of the communication that we really do need to get through to not only people and stakeholders involved in the process, but the general users of those things as well, because it's the data that provides many, many different services. And I think it's probably, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, why do you think people are not don't realize that data is an asset? Why do you think that there's this, I don't know what it is, like laissez-faire attitude?
Yeah, I don't know. It's one of the great puzzles that I've come to realize in our industry in working in transformation, because particularly in the design and construction stages where I've spent a lot of my career, people will be happy to move along with technology, with devices, with sitting at home in the bath, walking the streets of wherever they're just about to go on holiday on Google Earth, and then picking out restaurants they're going to go to and trips they're going to go to, and then booking the holiday and paying for it, transferring money, and that they'll do all that at home on their mobile devices, and then go to work and roll out sheets of paper. And it's just one of those great things where there's an approach to your personal life, and there's an agreed traditional approach to working. And I don't know why those are so far apart, because they're certainly not that far apart in my life, in my working life, because I'm bringing the digital that I'd use in my personal life to my working life and vice versa. So I think that will change in time. It's going to take a little while, but there is that, somehow there's that lack of appreciation of data, whether it's seen as being someone else's job or not a core part of someone's job, despite the fact it can make their lives a lot easier.
That's really interesting, and I agree with you completely on that. That break that seems to happen between people's home lives and being digitally connected. But then as soon as they walk into the office, that something seems to shift. And one of the things I'm wondering about is the impact that branding has, and whether data seems to be placed in a kind of a technology bucket, if you like. And therefore, to your point, it's someone else's problem. It's technology's problem to worry about the data, rather than, in all of the examples that you've just mentioned, yes, they're using technology devices in order to access the data. But yet I rarely see data being kind of promoted to that same visibility and that same level. Things are changing, especially with the rise of the role of the chief data officer. But I still don't think we're quite there yet. I think people still sort of assume it's technology adjacent, for example, or part of technology.
Well, it's something that, again, someone else drew my attention to when we talk about BIM compared to talking about IT. Because IT, information technology, and yet the focus has been largely on the technology side and less about the information. And it's almost like we're wandering blindly into that same thing with BIM as well, or we have had it done to us by the technology providers. So there are ways you can describe certain things, and with BIM it's the information that's the more important part. Whether it's a building or whether you are building it or not, or whether it's a model or management or whatever you choose the M to stand for, it's about information management. It's about the information that's key. And I don't know whether, again, people will listen to this and think about it in a different way or assume I'm wrong or whatever, but I see data given context as being information. So data can just be raw and meaningless, but as soon as you give it context, you either give it a position or a purpose or a meaning, it becomes information. So data is one step a little bit further beyond what a lot of people are comfortable with understanding what information is. So they can read something as a timetable or a map or a whatever, but behind that is a set of data that presents it in a way that has information to most people. So I think there's a lot of different ways that it can be described and presented to people. But yeah, there are roles popping up. I was reading the other day, Chief Metaverse Officer is another one coming up. So companies will have those at some point if they're product manufacturers or they just food and beverage marketing, whatever they're on. They've got a target to aim for in the future for something that doesn't yet exist. But the way I've said it before, that BIM is not a sexy thing to do, and yet the mention of digital twins, that gets people's creative minds going. That sounds very interesting. But a digital twin really relies on a static set of information about that thing. So if a digital twin is going to perform in the same way as the physical, then it really does need a consistent set of data about it. So yeah, we've had a hard time trying to explain to people what BIM is and isn't. That was a large part of what drove the relaunch of the identity for the UK BIM Alliance. So we don't start talking about the BIM part. That will come later. We're not dropping BIM. We're absolutely still with the whole BIM discussion. But we introduce it at the right time. Information management hooks a lot more people in terms of their daily challenges, whether you're screwing things to walls on a building site, or whether you're maintaining a rail line, the information management piece hooks you in, and you understand that that's part of your job. If we bring in the BIM discussion at the relevant point, it becomes relevant to them. So product manufacturers, we can talk to product manufacturers day in, day out about information management, about what information they are providing to their sales teams, their marketing teams, or the customers. There's information there that they manage throughout that process. So we can talk to them about that. If we start the conversation by talking about BIM, they automatically assume, because of marketing for years and years by technology providers, it's a 3D model of a thing. That's not for us right now. It looks expensive. It's whatever. There's always a reason not to. So yeah, we talk about it in a different way now about information management. It just so happens that Nima has IM in the middle of it, which wasn't an accident. But it's absolutely part of our new approach to trying to engage a wider sector of the built environment.
There's so many things that you've said that resonate quite well with me. And when you talk about, information management and BIM being an enabler for things, more sexier things, let's say, it's a bit like the conversation I tend to have about data governance. It's the same thing. And when you dilute some of the terminology, actually, it's data governance. It's about setting standards. It's about creating a governing structure. It's about putting things in order, really, right? It's tidying your house up, so that you can achieve the cool things that you would like to deliver, right? And it sounds like BIM is the same thing. It's just that it's being somehow put into the construction box versus being thought of, in its kind of core, or the core concepts of it. So I guess my other question that I'm wondering is, can you share some do's and don'ts? So what have you seen where people have monumentally got it wrong when implementing BIM?
Well, again, I'm going to piggyback on the conversation I started then about the new identity for the UK BIM Alliance. One of the things we were always accused of being was the BIM police. And we tried to get away from that. So the new set of behaviours isn't about that. It never was. I mean, it never was really about correcting people or telling people they're doing wrong. But the new identity isn't just a brand. It's not just a set of graphics and a new name. It's a new set of active and proactive behaviours that the people and the volunteers have got, that we're promoting them to project out to industry. So it's more about encouraging people in the results from what they've been doing, rather than saying, you've done this wrong, you've done that wrong, you've done this wrong, which a lot of people have slipped into. So I'm not going to answer that first question. I'll answer the second part, the do's, but the don'ts, I'm not going to. In fact, the only don't I'd say is don't get drawn into the perception that it's about just a 3D model of an asset. It's not really what the value is. It's a low-hanging fruit. Yes, it probably will be part of it at some point, but actually the data is the important part. So the do is focus on the data, focus on the information. And as I said earlier, don't worry about the rest of the people. Don't worry about the client asking you to. You can drive value in an organization without a client asking you to do a project. Because if you manage your own information internally about what you do on a daily basis, and you understand that there's a process of bringing in data, creating data, exporting and sharing data, if you understand the processes that are involved in all of those different activities, then you can start to automate stuff. Then you can apply the right software, the right technologies, and you get consistency, you get checkability, you get scalability, and all of those things that makes your job a bit easier in governing that data by having it created in a sensible, managed way in the first place. So, as I said, I keep going to product manufacturers, to owners, operators, architects, engineers, contractors, project managers, cost consultants, everyone that's involved in this huge industry that we're in. There's so many benefits and opportunities for people to understand the information they use, how it's created, how much they rely on it, and how they can make savings by moving it to a more digital, data-driven workflow.
Amen. So that's fine. I will accept that answer. And certainly, one of the things I think about with 3D modeling is, in particular, is I think there's and a little bit with the metaverse, right? So long as you've got a real use case for it, I'm 100% on board. But I think sometimes we try to, just squeeze ourselves into, new technologies, new concepts, or certain things just to, be with the cool kids, right? You don't need a 3D model for absolutely everything. Sometimes a bar chart is actually sufficient. And I'm glad you've clarified that the value of BIM extends beyond just the 3D modeling. However, I am going to poke you a little bit, because there is nothing that can be perfect, and you've painted a wonderful picture of BIM, which has excited me a lot about learning more about it. But I'm going to challenge you to tell me a little bit about, what are maybe the things that could be worked on where it relates to BIM? What are the things that are still a bit of a work in progress?
Okay, so I'll pick on two things. The second thing is it's about how we've got, and I think it came up in the session where I met you a few weeks ago, is we've digitalized what we've got rather than using digital to create something to aim for. So I'll come back to that in a minute. The first thing, the thing that we can do here and now, is the language that we use in the BIM process. It's almost like a BIM language in itself. And that's come about through various different reasons, for various different proper justifications. But it's like people need to learn a new language to be able to talk about BIM, to engage with it. And that's something we need to change significantly. And that's another one of the key parts behind the new identity of the UK BIM Alliance as Nima, is we can communicate the ISO 19650 suite of documents, the process. We can communicate that with lots of different groups of people in their language, rather than talking to them in ISO 19650 language. And I think by doing that, we'll gain a lot more traction and get a lot more implementation across the industry as a whole. So the language that we use needs to be the person's language, a people level language of just getting stuff done on site, getting stuff done through design process, getting stuff done in operation, in facility management, whatever it happens to be, just getting stuff done. They don't need BIM language to be able to do that. That will come in time if it needs that. But I would rather they focus on a data language than a BIM language, because that might mean that they start to talk about data things in data ways. So coming back to the other thing, the BIM process is really about digitizing a fairly traditional process, using different mechanisms, technology, software, and whatever to get a digital data set. But actually, what we really need is something that we use the industry or other industries' understanding of digital to get to new business models, new ways of operating, new ways of providing services, and we head towards that. Then there are really interesting conversations ongoing. I'm part of a digital network within the Construction Leadership Council, a government organisation to understand how we serve the construction industry. But there's digital aspects to all of the work streams and the work going on there, but it's not quite at the level where it's very, I don't think I'll be criticised for saying this, but it's a very operational level. So it's here and now. How do we as an industry support the construction leadership? How do we as construction leaders support the construction industry? But we do need to consider other approaches. So where are the left field approaches to how we're delivering the business models that are behind the way we procure and build and all of those things. So at the moment we're digitizing rather than digitalizing, and we need to digitalize first to have something to aim for. But there's exciting work going on there, as we said, but nothing I can share right now.
Oh dear, now I'm really curious.
Yeah, got to drop a little tease in there somewhere.
You already have. So I'm glad you mentioned this, because you and I met at the Red Foundation Forum a few weeks ago. And as you know, I sit on the Data Ethics Steering Committee. And so one of the things that I'm really passionate about is doing the right thing where it relates to data, whether it's through the governance of data, whether through ethical usage of data. And really, more than anything, it's about transparency. It's people's right to choose how their data is collected and used, etc. And on top of that, understanding what they're signing up to, because there's one thing knowing that your data is being collected and used, but there's another thing about really understanding what you're signing up to. And you mentioned the fact that, you know, BIM could be a real enabler for the introduction of IoT, smart building technology. You know, to me, that kind of, there's a natural step forward from smart building technology to the development of smart cities, for example. It's I feel like there's a natural kind of evolution from that. So I guess I was going to ask you about pipeline, which you said that you can't share too much about, but you know, are these types of, you know, ethical considerations on data, you know, growth in the depth of the standards, or, you know, review of standards based on our current needs or our future goals, is that something that is being considered as part of BIM?
Yeah, it is. And I don't want to give the impression that the whole BIM thing can solve everything, but it's kind of a pragmatic approach to understanding where the possibilities and opportunities of BIM begin and end. And I think if we're honest, and again, part of the new identity, it's understanding that there's a certain point that we can feasibly go to in encouraging industry to change. And as the UK BIM Alliance, as Nima, we kind of want to, as I keep saying, we're a volunteer organisation. There's only so much we can do. We'd love more volunteers and more engagement, more people to spread best practice and news and things, but there's only so much we can do. And if that only so much is to create a really good set of data about a thing, then let's leave that there. Because there are so many opportunities. There are other initiatives that are running with other different things. And part of the reason behind our new identity is to then link people in the design and construction and operation phases with other initiatives. So like we said, the Red Foundation, Real Estate Data Foundation, I don't think they would have engaged with us as the UK BIM Alliance as much as they are now, with us being Nima, being information management for real estate, bringing the standards and that level of rigor, as you said, to the data that is used in real estate, because they're going to be making decisions based on that data at some point. So whether it's floor area that's measured in a certain way that might be automatically taken from a BIM dataset, BIM model, three-dimensional model, or understanding thermal performance, so they're going to understand how much energy this building uses or this thing uses over its life cycle. They're going to be making real decisions on those things. So that governance, that provenance, and all of those things that come into play really need to be nailed. And I think that's the appreciation of that, at least, needs to be understood and shared. But yeah, in terms of where we're going, engaging with prop tech, engaging with real estate people, engaging with anyone else that's creating a software as a service or insights or whatever data about those things and using, or that requires data about the built environment. The BIM process has it in a process through design construction, through collecting data on existing assets as well. It's not just for new build, it's for existing assets as well. Through that process and handing over a good data set for those decisions to be made that can be trusted. That's ideally what we're here for.
Amazing. So on that note, I think this is a good place to wrap up. But before we do, I will ask you, what advice would you give an organization that was just starting out on its BIM journey? You know, one that has all the complexities of an existing portfolio with some, you know, developments ongoing, and they need a way they're looking to implement BIM to manage all of that complexity. What would you tell them?
Hopefully, and it doesn't just apply to BIM, understand what your daily challenges are, because there must be, every organization has a thing that they're battling with every day. As much as people like to think that everything's slick and smooth and everything, and I've explained the BIM process as being slick and smooth, it's not. It's bloody hard work sometimes. But I think understanding where your challenges are and breaking them down into what the blockers are, what those things are, what the information that's creating or supporting those blockers are, driving that down into the data that you require about those things is a good starting point. And again, it's starting from sitting around the boardroom and going, right, why haven't you done this? And what's the reason? and that's a challenge. Just take that and understand that and dive into that a bit more, because that's going to drive information requirements about the physical thing that you're doing, and then understanding how you can procure that data or that information about that thing has got to be a good starting point. If people are just starting off thinking, I want a 3D model, that's great in some ways, but you've got to have a use case for it. You've got to understand what you're going to do with it afterwards, because having it for visuals, it's kind of okay. It's valuable in a public consultation. It's valuable in accessing data perhaps later down the line. But if you don't have the data, then those things start to fall apart quite quickly.
I think that's pretty solid advice. In a lot of different contexts. Figure out what it is that you should be looking at and what's important to you before you go any further. I couldn't agree more. Great. Well, Casey, thank you so much for taking this time to talk to me about all things BIM, all things sustainability. This has been really enlightening for me. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.